Red Alliance trying to score some last-second cargo into the rocket ship on the near side of the field, and time is over for this match.
This is the abridged version of the presentation. We had a little bit of a teaser yesterday, and we're going to go with the full version in Detroit next week, and that's going to be streamed live, hopefully for all of you to see. But right now, we're just going to kind of go over how to design a first robot. And when we talk about how to design a first robot, we're not jumping into CAD. We're talking about how to conceptualize a robot that can succeed in competition. So let's take a look at our first slide here. And if we can jump to the next slide. There we go. Strategic design. So this is a whole field in first that a lot of people take part in, but they don't even realize they're doing it. Strategic design is the backbone to any FRC, FLL, or FTC robot. It is the process of how to conceptualize what your robot needs to do. Designing and building a robot is a lot of fun, but designing and building a robot that does well in competition is way cooler. But it's hard to do that without a concrete aim. So we're talking about goal setting here. Now, even before you get to your goal setting, you have to determine your aim here. So forget about what you want your robot to do. And most people, the most basic way, and for the scope of this presentation, we're going to talk about designing a robot that does well in competition. However, that's not always the only goal. Some teams want to have a cool robot that does unique functions. And that's a very valid goal if that's your team's goal. However, for this presentation, we're going to focus on how to build a robot that wins, which is usually the goal of most teams. However, there's no shame if that's not your goal. You do need to be a bit aware of the cool factor, because if you aren't designing a robot with a focus on winning, you could be letting your alliance partners down throughout the season if you just decide to design a robot that's complicated for the sake of complication. However, it's your team's robot, so your goals are set by yourself. So don't feel pressure to design a robot in any specific way. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so game analysis. This is how where it all starts. You cannot design a robot unless you know what you want it to do. We're talking this is very Zen here. This is very Wayne Gretzky, where I don't go where the puck is. I go where the puck is going to go. You need to know what you want your robot to do. And how do you... And this sounds so obvious, but teams miss it all the time, because what teams end up doing is the game comes out, they watch the animation, and they just start drawing up concepts of what a robot should look like. And they're just that's the first step. But that shouldn't be the first step. The first step is to figure out how to win and what a winning robot could look like. And how do you do that? You read the rules. We have usually a 120-page game manual. It's a lot of words, but honestly, you read way more in high school English class. And this is a little bit more interesting. But you need to go through the rules in detail to understand how the game is played. You have to understand every single possible way of scoring points. So an example this year that I think a lot of teams overlooked. Teams kind of saw that you can climb to level 1, you can climb to level 2, you can climb to level 3. And I think everyone kind of saw, oh, there's room for one robot on level 3, you can get 2 robots on level 2, you can get a bunch of robots on level 1. But I think a lot of teams didn't do this analysis and didn't realize maybe you can get multiple robots on level 3. Level 3 is so valuable, it's worth 12 points, that maybe it's worth making some design sacrifices, and we're going to talk about trade-offs, to make it easier for me to climb with a partner. There was huge value that went untapped this year in building a small robot. You do not have to use your full 128 frame perimeter. It is very possible to build a competitive FRC robot at 24 by 24. It's difficult, but maybe this year it was valuable. But teams didn't even have this discussion because it was kind of assumed one robot at the top. And that's why it's important to do this sort of analysis. You also need to examine ways to prevent your opponents from scoring. Denying X number of points is the same value as scoring X number of points, except when it comes to our ranking point incentives. Still, defense has a place in FRC games. This year's game should have screamed to people that defense was going to be happening. They even put it in the rules that you could have one robot specifically to play defense, and only one robot. That should have been an eye-opener. You look at the field layout this year. When I see this field layout, I see choke points. I see alleyways where it's hard to get through. Those are all signs that defense can be important. We have a lot of robots here at the championship who are playing defense. Most of them aren't designed to play defense. They've pivoted from other objectives. There was another opening this year for teams to design defense-specific robots that can occupy these choke points. But you don't identify that stuff unless you really break down the rules. The other big thing to break down is the ranking system. So for years in First, back when I was just a college mentor, the ranking system was very weird. You were rewarded, your rank was based on your opponent's score. It was bizarre. And that was super important to understand. Then we went through what I call the golden age of FRC from 2004 to 2009, at least the golden age of ranking systems, where teams were just ranked based on how many matches they won. It was simple. You knew what your objective was. Your goal is to win matches. That was a nice objective. It was easy to figure out. First had a paradigm shift in 2015. The ranking system, after the 25 season, the ranking system now rewards you for winning matches, but there are also secondary objectives. And those secondary objectives need to be factored into all your design decisions. So you need to be designing for RPs. This year, there was 2 separate RPs and they were very distinct. One was for completing a rocket. One was for getting at least 15 points on the HAB. And if you want to be a team that can rank high at these events, there is a Minotaur standing in front of me. That is interesting. Sup, Minotaur? If you want to be a top 8 team at these events, you need to design for at least one of the ranking points. And if you don't, it's not going to happen. Now, the ranking point systems, I'm a huge fan of it, because this year, the rocket was something you could do on your own if you were amazing. I like rewarding the top teams for that. However, it could be a collaborative goal as well, and that was cool too, so it's something that could be done with partners. The HAB RP mainly could be done by one team if a team could get to level 3. However, there was a collaborative aspect to it. I talked to a lot of teams this year and they said, we're not designing for level 3. And I said, why? They said, at our early events, we don't think there's going to be enough teams that are doing it, so we don't think it's going to be a factor. And by our later events, we think there's going to be enough teams who can go to level 2 that we think we can get to the 15 points by having 2 level 2s in matches. That's a smart way of thinking of things and saying, maybe I don't need to go for the biggest goal. Maybe I don't have those resources. I'm going to look at 2 of the best teams in the world right now, teams 3683 and 1241 from Ontario. They were both one won the provincial championship, one was finalist. Neither of them had a level 3 climb. They also knew that in the elimination rounds, and maybe this was a false assumption because things are changing with this game, they said, the best team's going to be a level 3 climber. They're going to not need another level 3 climber, so they're just going to pick the best scoring robot. And if we don't spend time on a level 3 climb, we can be one of the best scoring robots. And it worked amazingly for them. We'll talk more about this, about trade-offs as we go forward with this, but it's really important to understand you don't need to do everything. But you can't figure out what not to do unless you break the game down with this game analysis, and that's the strategic design process. So now that we've broken the game down, how do we figure out how to choose what we're going to do? We'll find that out by going to slide number 7. There we go. Thank you very much. So we're going to take a little bit of a sidebar here. This is a fun conversation topic. Chokehold strategies. A chokehold strategy is a strategy which, when executed, guarantees victory independent of any action by your opponents. This should be one of the first things you do in your strategic design process and in your game analysis. Here's the sad part. The first game design committee is very, very good at what they do, and they design their games to avoid having chokeholds present. Years ago, 2002, there was a game with a chokehold. And it's a cool story. I love this story. There were 380-pound goals on the field, and goals were worth 10 points if you got them into your goal zone. So if you got all 3 goals, that would be worth 30 points. You got points for scoring balls and goals, and the goals were neutral. They didn't belong to either alliance. You got points if you scored balls and goals if the goals were in your zone. That means if I took the 3 goals to my zone, my opponents couldn't score any points for getting balls. So I've got 30 points locked in here. The other way of scoring points was having robots parked in your own zone at the end of the match. So an alliance only has 2 robots. So they can only get 2 robots back there. So 30-20, this is looking pretty good. However, the games were brutal back then. You could kidnap robots back then and drag a robot to your home zone. If you did that, if you grabbed one of them, we're at 30-30. They can't grab me because I'm in my goal zone right now. And wait a second, this is a 30-30 tie. All I have to do is take 3 goals and park. What was the tiebreaker that year? The number of goals. This was a chokehold strategy. If one robot could take 540 pounds of goals and themselves and park in a zone and not be pulled out of there, they would win every match. That sounds really hard. It's 540 pounds of goals. Some teams did this analysis. Most teams didn't do this analysis. They were just like, I got to score balls. And they weren't very good. Some teams did this analysis and were like, that is way too hard. These goals were like spread across the width of the field. There was one team, Team 71, and all of you guys know about Team 254. They're the gold standard in first right now. Before 254 was 254, Team 71 was the gold standard. They've won 4 world championships as well. 254 and them are the only teams to have done that. They built their robot, and the rules were different then. You could do a lot of crazy things. Their robot stood up vertically to start the match, then fell over, because that way they could make their robot longer. Then it expanded these massive arms, PVC arms, and would drive forward and would clamp onto all 3 goals. It had no ability to let go of the goals once they grabbed them, because they figured they couldn't afford that sort of functionality. When they would drive forward, they would go full speed in a super, super high gear. Then they would shift into a low gear that was inches per second. And instead of moving on wheels, they used file cards, which are now illegal in FRC. But they basically gripped the carpet like Velcro, and they dug into it. The robot had no ability to turn. They did not have the ability to turn. They had to give that up to be able to do this, but they thought it was so important. So they would grab onto all 3 goals, whip them back in, and then drag 540 pounds plus themselves into the zone at about an inch or 2 per second. But once they got the goals, they were so heavy now, no one could push them, and they had the chokehold. And they won the world championship that year. I wish I had a video of it here. I'll play it next week in Detroit. There's one video of them. They actually tried to grab all 3 goals at one point, but they missed, and they grabbed another robot. Remember I told you they can't let go? And then another one of their opponents decided to try and grab one of the goals they were holding on to, and so they just dragged everyone. They dragged 3 goals, 2 robots, and just dummied them. And that was their road to the world championship. But that's a chokehold strategy. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but why is it important to look for a chokehold strategy, even though we know there's probably not going to be one? By looking for a chokehold strategy, you're going to find an optimal strategy, because you're going to see the true value of points and how things balance and what you need to do to win. So that's why we look for chokehold strategies. It goes back to the whole thing. When you chase perfection, you will catch excellence along the way. When you go look for a chokehold strategy, you will find cool things. Next slide. All right, so cost-benefit analysis. I hate to sound like one of my old economics profs, but this is important stuff. When we talked about how to prioritize, we talked about analyzing a game and figuring out what tasks are available. But how do you figure out which tasks are most important? What you need to do is compare the difficulty of accomplishing the task to the reward for doing so. And in terms of FRC games, the reward is points or ranking points. So you're looking for the tasks that get you the biggest bang towards winning a match. So big point values to help you towards the 2 RP, or big objectives that help you towards your secondary RPs. But you have to compare that to the difficulty of accomplishing them. This year, the single biggest task that could have been done was lifting 2 robots to the level 3 hat. Obviously valuable. There's 36 points in that. And if you look at the amount of points available in this game, 36 is an overwhelming amount. However, that challenge is really, really hard. But you need to kind of look and compare these values. Climbing to level 3, and this is an interesting one. This is one where I would say this is the first year where I missed on strategic analysis, at least since 2012, because I thought that the level 3 climb was going to be way harder than it is. And this is the hardest, I think, understanding that with the value, at least for me, and I'm a mathematician by trade, not an engineer, it is very easy for me to look at a game and figure out which point values stand out and which tasks kind of make the most sense. It is not so easy for me to figure out how difficult something is to accomplish. And that's where teamwork comes in. And that's why engineers are important on your team. And also just having a wealth of knowledge of past FRC games to see what has worked. I was thinking the difficulty of level 3 this year was going to be closer to climbing to level 3 in 2013, ascending that pyramid. So I thought it was going to be crazy hard. It actually wasn't that bad. And that's why at the Ontario Provincial Championship, the rate of level 3 of the HAB RP was about 85%. So like it was high up there. But you need to figure out which tasks get you the most bang for your buck. And we're going to talk about what that buck and what form that takes in just a minute. But it's always about how do you evaluate how difficult something is. And people wonder, they always ask, why are the same teams always at the top? Why are the same teams so good? The biggest reason that the top teams stay good is a lack of turnover and a huge wealth of experience when it comes to FRC. When it comes to trying to understand which tasks are difficult, even some of the best engineers out there in the world, if you brought them in, they would struggle to evaluate this. You need that full depth of knowledge of what has happened in past FRC seasons, what works and what doesn't, and what teams are capable of. So if you want to improve your team right now and you're on a rookie team, the most important thing I can tell you is, for the last 10 years, go back and look at the top 25 robots from each year and try and see how much they were accomplishing and what types of designs they had. Because right now, every year, and the biggest mistake teams make is they try and do too much because they think they need to, and they think they're capable of doing so. And I will also say every year, the last 4 years, in my opinion, the best team in the world, aside from Team 254, has been Team 2056 from Ontario. And if you look at their robots, they are simple. There is nothing to them because they focus on just doing enough to complete those tasks, to get their RPs, and they try and do it in the simplest possible way, and that is important. Let's hit the next slide. So now, you got to come up with a priority list. You factored in what's most important. I like to have 2 different priority lists and then merge them together. Number 1, I want to talk about generic robot qualities. This year's game is a game where I would not have prioritized speed. The reason for that is all the objectives were in a close proximity. There was no reason to design your robot to have a top speed of 20 feet per second because you didn't have the acceleration distance to make it. This year, I would have definitely designed for acceleration because you're in tight quarters and you have to zip around defense. And when someone's playing mainline defense on you, to beat them around, you need acceleration, not top speed. Single speed drives this year had a lot of value, but those are the types of qualities that I'm talking about: speed, power. Some teams this year designed for power to push through defense. I talked to 118 yesterday, had a really good interview with them. They designed specifically for agility. They wanted to be lightweight. They said, our robot's going to come in at less than 100 pounds so they could dance around defense. 2 very different schools of thought. Which is more impressive? Which is more important for this year's game? Maybe I'll tell you after Einstein, because I still don't know. There's a lot going on. Your other list is your desired robot functionality. This is a high-level look of what your robot is going to be. And so, I could talk about the 1114 example this year. The number 1 thing on that list this year was level 3 climb. And it said, we have to have the fastest level 3 climb in the world, and we're going to sacrifice a bunch of other stuff. Their goal was to win a world championship, and they wanted that speed for level 3. Other things that were lower on the priority list were things like scoring backwards, having ability for like quick ejects, that sort of stuff. And since that stuff was lower on the priority list, it never happened because it's focusing on what's at the top of your priority list. So at this point, you merge these 2 lists, and this is your religious text for the season. This is your Bible, this is your Quran. This is going to tell you what you need to be doing. Throughout the season, you will have to make trade-offs because 125 pounds is not enough. But how do you decide what to cut? You've got to go back to your priority list. You never should be cutting from your top priorities. Let's hit the next slide. All right, priority list. What should be number 1? What should be number 2? What should be number 3? Let's ignore end games for right now. Let's ignore end games. What should always be the number 1 priority? And this even involves end games. What should always be the number 1 priority? Anyone in the audience? Right. Moving. And people get this wrong every year. Every year, it's like score or climb. Here's the thing. You cannot score unless your robot can move. You cannot climb unless your robot can move. Your drivetrain is the heart of your robot. So this slide has multiples, so let's hit the next point. Lino? There we go. Everything's up there on the board right now, but we'll talk about them. But movement is number one. The other big fact why movement is important is if everything else on your robot doesn't work, and this happens, you're coming to the championship and you realize you only score 2 cargo a match, and you realize your climb takes 45 seconds and there's always someone faster, you can still win the world championship if your drivetrain is rock solid. And that's why it always has to be your number one priority. And pivoting to defense is a major thing. We've seen the rankings right now. Most of you know if you're going to be in the top 8 or not. And if you aren't one of the top scoring teams, you can still get picked, but you got to pivot to defense. And you cannot do that without a robust and rugged drivetrain. So that's one of the reasons. People are always like, why do teams always use 6 traction wheels? Because they know if they have 6 traction wheels on their robot, they can still be a useful defender at all. People are like, why do people always make fun of Mecanum wheels? I mean, and there are many reasons, but Mecanum wheel drivetrains are great until you get to the point where you want to pivot to defense, and you can't. There was a qualification match. That dropped by 5 minutes, man. Yeah. How did that just happen? It said 11:14 just a second ago, and now it's like down to 4 something. All right, we got to move quickly through this. I could talk more about Mecanum bots later. Your next priority in terms of scoring, forget about the end game right now. People always think about scoring, the actual scoring process. It's the acquisition and the release process. Cycle times is a big topic. How many cycles can you do? This year, everyone was like, oh, you can do so many cycles because the drive distance is shorter. Yes, the drive distance is shorter. However, after years and years of analysis on cycle times, the biggest determining factor, like if you were to build a model of cycle times and do it by variables, the most vulnerable variable is your acquisition and your release. Drive speed is like a linear function. You know, it's not truly linear. Like it's, you know, it's got a bit of a curve to it. But you can make exponential gains with acquisition and release. You look at the best panel mechanisms this year, they're into the loading station, boom! No fiddling around, no... that's the most annoying thing, watching robots try and score when they do this thing. That's terrible. If you're doing that, you're doing it the wrong way. Acquisition and release, that should be your priority. You can start prototyping it earlier. That's got to be the focus. Only then is score the priority. Now, release is part of it, but let's hit the next slide. Let's see how much more we can cover here in the next 3 minutes. We talked about these yesterday, but I'm going to talk about them again. If there's only 2 things you're going to take away, these golden rules. Number 1, always build within your team's limits. We talked about building a priority list. How do you choose how far down that priority list you go? You need to know what your team's limits are. Limits are defined by the amount of students and the amount of people you have on your team. I have the term manpower in there, but that's a gendered term. I need to get that out of there. That's a terrible term. Budget and experience. That determines how much you can do in the season. Not all FRC teams are created equally. It's a misnomer when people try and talk about that. Let's all check our privilege here. We know that some teams have more resources and can do more. It's understanding what your resources are. However, if you maximize your own resources, you can definitely outperform the teams with more resources. It is a very doable thing. It happens every year at the championship. Some of the teams with the biggest budgets in first are also some of the worst teams at first. It's actually kind of hilarious because they don't watch this presentation. It's just a bunch of 60-year-old mentors working on a robot together. Shots fired. Don't try and do too much. If you build simple, you can go really, really far. Think of all these robots this year who did not try and touch rockets levels 2 and 3, but are at championship and succeeding. You don't need to do everything. On the other hand, this is a program of inspiration. Don't sell yourself short. As you get more experienced, push boundaries, and that's how you make leaps to the next sort of tier. Golden rule number 2, if a team has 30 units of robot functions and you have a maximum of 10 units, it's better to do 3 things at 10 out of 10 than 5 at 6 out of 10. The jack of all trades is the master of none. Just pick a few things and be really good at it. We talked about this yesterday. Teams were so focused on trying to score both directions this year. It was really valuable last year. But that is really, really hard. And do you need to do it? Do you need to spend on that extra robot function? Or maybe you can just build a simple robot that oh the horrors, has to turn every once in a while, and get that robot done 2 weeks earlier and spend more time practicing, spend more time programming for the sandstorm, have more feedback for your drivers. If you build simple, you can do cooler things and be more effective. And if we hop back to the last slide, as we were talking about, don't actually hop back because we're running out of time, you can really fine tune your acquisition and release. Because that's stuff that, as much as you design for it, you figure stuff out as the season goes on. So you want, the more complicated your robot is, the more things that could fail and the less time you have to improve efficiency. We are at the 45-second mark here, so I think we're just going to close things out. If you want to see the full version of this presentation, it will be broadcast next week from Detroit. We're going to hopefully get the whole 2-hour thing on stream. Lino's going to make it happen somehow. I'm putting him in charge. And just kind of remember, all the stuff that we talked about it in the context of the first robotics competition, but this is about problem solving. Our world is filled with big problems right now. And the generation before me really messed it up. My generation did a pretty good job of mucking it up, and it's on you guys to fix it. And these are the skills that you need to solve big problems. Because you have to approach the problem, find a way to break it down, figure out what the priorities are, and we have to prioritize. We can't solve everything overnight, but we have to figure out what our priorities are. And if we do that, that's how we're going to take these lessons from FIRST. We already know how to make FIRST a better place, but we can make this world a better place. It's about problem solving. That's what engineers do. That's what the future rock stars do, and that's what all of you are. So thank you for coming to this presentation, and we'll see you around. I think we're going to go to play-by-play right now, so hope you enjoyed it, everyone.
I am Dennis Duran, and I am here with the fierce